The smell of neatsfoot oil and old leather has been the first thing I notice every morning for going on 3 years now. That deep, slightly sweet musk that clings to the walls of Halford's shoe repair. The way certain memories cling to you long after you've stopped trying to hold on to them. My grandfather opened this shop in 1978, when the Portside neighborhood was still working docks and union halls, and men who wore their boots until the soles separated completely. He built the wooden counter himself, sanded every surface by hand, hung the same clock above the door, that still runs 4 minutes fast, because he always said a person should be early. When he died 2 years ago and left the shop to me, I was 22 years old with a half-finished art history degree and no idea what I was doing. I figured it out, slowly badly at first and then better. By the time I was 24, I could resole a work boot in under 40 minutes and identify a leather grade by touch alone. My hands had gone rough at the knuckles, permanently stained in the creases from polish and dye. I kept my dark hair pulled back while I worked, and wore an apron my grandfather had owned so long it didn't smell like anything anymore except the shop itself. I knew every regular by name: Earl, who brought in his fish without fail; Mrs. Abramowitz from the dry cleaner 3 doors down; the teenagers from the vocational school who came in clusters, never quite sure if they were supposed to knock or just walk in. The neighborhood was changing, though, had been for a while. The coffee shop that used to be a bait and tackle store. The wine bar where the hardware store stood for 40 years. Condos going up at the end of the block where the cannery warehouse used to be, all glass and steel, rents that made the remaining old-timers go quiet when the subject came up. I understood what was coming the way you understand a storm before it arrives. By the pressure in the air. By the way people started having conversations they didn't finish. So when Peg from the laundromat next door knocked on my back door one Thursday morning in October, holding a letter printed on very heavy paper, I wasn't completely surprised. I was just tired in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet. Crestline Development Group, she read, as if I couldn't see it myself. They're buying the whole block, Neva. The whole thing. Sal at the hardware store got the same letter. So did the Nyians. I set down the pump I'd been stitching and took the letter from her. The language was careful, professional, and ultimately very clear. They intended to acquire the property I leased and redevelop the site as part of a mixed-use harbor revitalization project. They were inviting business owners to meet with a representative of the company to discuss options. Options. Like there were a lot of them. "What are we supposed to do?" Peg asked. "Go to the meeting, I guess," I said. "See what they actually want." They sent the CEO. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected a junior development associate in a blazer, the kind of person trained to deliver bad news pleasantly. Instead, on a gray Monday morning, with the kind of cold drizzle that comes off the harbor in November and settles into your bones, a black SUV pulled up outside, and a man stepped out who did not look like a junior anything. I knew who he was before he walked in: Silas Morrow. I'd researched Crestline after Peg's visit, habit probably, the same instinct that made me vet a leather supplier before placing an order. He was 38, the founder of Crestline, had turned a small regional property company into something operating in 11 states. The articles described him as visionary and meticulous. The photographs showed a man with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that was more interesting than handsome. A strong jaw, heavy brows, the kind of stillness in his expression that reads as either calm or controlled, and you can't always tell which from the outside. He walked into Halford's at 9:04 in the morning, and I didn't notice. That's the part I'm still a little embarrassed about, honestly. I had a pair of men's dress shoes on my workbench. Beautiful things, black calfskin, brought in for a full resole and a split seam along the left heel, and I was at the stage where you test the stitching under good light, holding the shoe up, running my thumb along the welt to feel for any inconsistency. The repair had come out better than I'd expected. The new sole was seamless. I held the shoe at eye level and turned it slowly, and when the seam caught the light exactly right, I let out a low whistle without thinking. The automatic kind. The sound you make when you're alone and something small goes exactly right. I wasn't alone. "That's a good sound," said a voice from the counter, and I nearly dropped the shoe. He was standing there with his hands in the pockets of a charcoal overcoat, watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not amused, exactly. Something quieter. Like he was cataloging what he'd just seen, and hadn't yet decided what category it belonged in. "We're closed for another 20 minutes, I said. A reflex, we weren't technically. And then I looked at him properly and said, "You're Silas Morrow." "And you're Neva Halford." He said my name the way you say a word you've looked up before saying it aloud, careful, checking himself. "I'm sorry for coming in unannounced. The door was unlocked." "It's always unlocked." I set the shoe down and pulled off my work gloves. There was a faded scar on the inside of his right wrist, visible below his cuff when he reached forward to set a business card on the counter. A pale, irregular mark that looked old. I noticed it the way I notice anything in the shop. As information. "I assume you're here about the letter." "I am." He looked around the way people do when they're really looking, at the tools hanging in order above the bench, the original painted sign my grandfather made, the wall of cubbies holding shoes waiting to be collected. "How long has this shop been here?" "Since 1978, my grandfather's." "And now yours." "And now mine." He picked up the dress shoe I'd been holding, which was a bold thing to do in someone else's workspace, and turned it the same way I had, running his thumb along the welt. He knew what he was doing. "This is clean work." "I know." Something shifted very slightly in his face. I think it was the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite get all the way there. He set the shoe down carefully. "I'd like to sit and talk with you if you have time. About the block. About what we're planning and what it might mean for a business like yours." I pulled 2 stools from under the counter, and we sat across from each other with the workbench between us, covered in leather scraps and wax tins and tools I should have put away an hour ago. I didn't apologize for any of it. He told me what Crestline was actually building. Not just condos, a mixed-use development with ground-floor commercial space deliberately held for local and independent businesses. A community workshop hub. A small business incubator. He spoke about it without the performance I'd anticipated. No glossy pitch language, just the specific details of what he was trying to build and why. I found myself listening in spite of my own resistance. "That's a nice story," I said when he finished. "But it doesn't change what happens to Earl Koval and the Nguyens and Peg's laundromat in the meantime." "No," he said, "it doesn't." I respected that he didn't try to argue with me. He made me a formal offer before he left, a position managing the small business hub once the development was complete. Business development coordinator, a salary that was more than I'd made in the previous 2 years combined, benefits, a real budget, real authority over the space and who occupied it. I told him I'd think about it. I went home that night to my apartment, 6 blocks from the harbor. Ate leftover soup standing over the sink, and thought about my grandfather. About the afternoon he'd taught me to resole my first shoe, making me do it over 3 times until I got the pressure even on the lasting pliers. About the way he'd talk to customers like they'd come to visit rather than to do business. About the fact that he'd worked that shop for 44 years, never made much money doing it, and never once seemed to regret a single day. Peg called at 9. "Take the job," she said, before I'd told her there was a job. Someone must have talked. "Neva, take it. This block is going either way, you know that. At least this way, something good comes out of it, and you're part of building it." "I haven't decided," I said. "Yes, you have. You're just making yourself feel better about it first." She wasn't wrong. I accepted the position 2 days later, in an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the harbor I'd been looking at from street level my whole life. Silas shook my hand across his desk, and I felt the same thing I'd felt the first time, that there was more going on underneath the surface of him than what he allowed to show. That whatever he offered the world was carefully selected. The next 3 months moved fast. I worked with the design team on the hub concept, sat in on lease structure meetings, learned more about commercial real estate and small business financing than I'd ever expected to need to know. It was hard and interesting, and occasionally I had to pretend to understand things for slightly longer than was comfortable before asking a question, but I was good at the core of it. at knowing what a neighborhood actually needed, at understanding why a space worked or didn't, because I'd grown up watching my grandfather figure that out every single day. Silas was involved. More involved than a CEO managing a large portfolio needed to be in one building's daily decisions. He showed up to the design meetings. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. I started to understand that this project was different from his others. That it was something personal, though I couldn't figure out the full shape of why yet. We had dinner for the first time in December, officially, a working dinner to review the programming framework with the architect. By the time the architect left, Silas and I were still at the table, talking over the end of a bottle of wine, about what actually makes a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood. I told him about my grandfather, and he went quiet in a way that meant he was genuinely listening, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. What was his name, he asked. Edward. Everyone called him Ed. I turned my wine glass between my hands. He had regulars who'd been coming in since the 70s. They weren't coming for the shoe repair after a certain point. They were coming because he knew their kids' names and remembered what they'd told him the visit before. That's what I miss most, not the business itself, the texture of it. Silas looked at his own hands for a moment. I grew up about 8 blocks from that shop, he said. I didn't know your grandfather, but I walked past that place probably 1,000 times. You grew up in Portside? Left at 20. Came back 15 years later as the person buying it. He said it flatly, no self-congratulation and no apology in it. I know how that looks. How does it look? Like betrayal, he said, depending on who you ask. The honesty of that landed differently than I expected. We stayed another hour. Over the following weeks, something between us shifted in the way it does. Slowly, and then suddenly, a rearrangement of how I thought about him when he wasn't in the room. I started knowing when he was going to disagree before he said anything. I started looking forward to the days he'd be on site. He started calling me Sparrow, which began as a reference to the whistle he'd heard. The morning he walked into the shop and became something else gradually, the way a name does when it stays. I should have been more careful. I knew that, even then. He was the one who'd bought my grandfather's block and employed me, and operated in a world I barely understood the edges of. But I wasn't careful, and I don't think he was either, not really. February was when it unraveled. I was closing up the on-site planning office one Thursday evening, 9 o'clock, the harbor wind sharp off the water, when 2 men walked in through the unlocked front door. They weren't workers from the construction crew. They had a kind of stillness in them that isn't calm. It's practice. The kind of stillness that means they've been still in bad situations before and know how to stay that way. The taller one looked at me for a long moment and then said Silas's name. Tell him Yusuf Kane is tired of being patient, he said. Tell him what he owes doesn't expire just because he changed his zip code. My voice came out steadier than the rest of me felt. I don't know what you're talking about. He will, the man's eyes moved around the room slowly, and tell him we know his people now, all of them. They left without touching anything. I stood still for probably 2 full minutes after the door closed. Then I called Silas. He was there in 12 minutes. He came alone, which I found out. Later was against the advice of the security consultant. His company kept on retainer. He came through the door and looked at me, the way you look at something you were afraid would be broken. Are you hurt? He asked first. I'm fine. Who is Yusuf Kane? He moved to the window and looked out at the harbor. In the reflection of the glass, I could see his face, which had gone somewhere I'd never seen it go before. Somewhere controlled and cold and tired. Sit down, he said, please. What he told me took a long time to get through. He'd grown up in Portside with no money, a lot of ambition, and the kind of quiet desperation that's invisible from the outside, because the people who have it learn early to keep it hidden. When he was in his 20s, building his first small property deals, he'd needed capital, and gotten it from sources that didn't operate through banks. Yusuf Kane ran a network tied to the port. Cargo theft, some smuggling, organized crime that hid itself inside logistics, because logistics is invisible to everyone, except the people doing it. Silas had taken money from people connected to that network. He'd paid it back, every dollar with interest, years ago. He'd spent the 7 years since then, cutting every tie he could reach. But Kane doesn't release people, he said. He finds use in them. Anyone who's touched his money, anyone who's been inside his operation, he considers that a permanent arrangement. I was quiet for a long time after he stopped talking. That's why you're building here, I said eventually. It's not just where you grew up. You're trying to make something real in the place where you made the choices you can't take back. Yes. And now those choices have found me. He flinched, just slightly. I should have been cleaner before I brought you anywhere near. You didn't bring me, I said. I walked in with my eyes open. That's a different conversation. I stood up and went to the window and stood next to him, looking at the same harbor. But I need to know what you're going to do about it, and I need a real answer. He didn't give me one that night. 3 weeks later, Silas was attacked in the parking garage of his office building. 2 men, no weapons. Just a message delivered with fists, which is what the security footage showed and what the police said indicated a warning rather than an actual attempt. He had a cracked rib, a concussion, a deep cut across his cheekbone that would scar. I heard about it at 7 a.m. from Frankie, his assistant, who called because Silas had listed me as his emergency contact sometime in the past month without telling me. I was at the hospital in under 20 minutes. I didn't stop to change out of the clothes I'd slept in. I don't think I turned the stove off, and I'd been making oatmeal. He was awake when I got there, sitting up in the hospital bed, looking bruised and exhausted and furious in his particular contained way, where almost nothing showed except in the set of his jaw. When I came through the door, his face changed. You didn't have to come, he started. I know that, I said. I sat down in the chair next to his bed. I'm here. We didn't say much for a while. I sat with him while the nurse came and went, while Frankie stopped by with updates he didn't want to hear, while the morning light shifted across the room, and the hospital sounds went on around us the way they do. Indifferent, continuous. When it was quiet, I finally asked him what he planned to do. Handle it, he said. How? He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. Silas. I waited until he looked at me. There are 2 ways to handle something like this. One of them I can't be part of. I need you to understand that clearly before you decide anything. I'm not going to hurt anyone, he said. His voice was tight. Then talk to the federal investigators. I looked it up after those men came to the office. The Port Authority Task Force has had an open investigation into Kane's network for 4 years. It came up in a DOJ press release last year. You were inside his operation, even if only at the edges. You know things they need. I leaned forward in the chair. You could end this, not manage it, end it. That means admitting things that will cost me most of what I've built. Not everything. He looked at me. You'd keep the part that matters, I said. Not your public name, the name underneath it. The one that came back to this neighborhood and tried to do something worth doing. I held his gaze and didn't look away. And you'd keep me, for whatever that's worth to you. The silence lasted long enough that I heard a cart roll by in the hallway outside. But if you handle it the other way, I said quietly, if you become the kind of person who makes problems disappear, the way Kane makes problems disappear, then I can't be here. I'm not built for that world, and I don't think you actually are anymore either. I think that's the entire point of everything you've been trying to build for the past 7 years. I think you know that. He looked out the window at the gray February sky for a long time. The company might not survive it, he said. The Portside project almost certainly won't. The press will run my name next to Kane's for months. Partners will pull out. Yes, I said, probably. You're asking me to bet everything on the idea that doing the right thing eventually means something. No, I said. I'm asking you to do the right thing regardless of whether it means anything. That's different. That's harder. That's also the only version I can respect. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, okay. It took 9 months. He cooperated with the federal task force through the spring and summer and into the fall, giving them documents and transaction records and names going back over a decade. Yusuf Kane was indicted in September along with 14 members of his network. Silas faced his own legal exposure. Substantial civil penalties, a federal consent decree, a forced restructuring that cost Crestline nearly 40% of its total assets. The press was exactly as bad as he'd predicted. Articles ran his name alongside Kane's. 3 major partners walked. 2 projects in other cities collapsed without their financing. He didn't go to prison. His cooperation and the peripheral nature of his direct involvement got him through that particular edge. But it was hard and public and ugly in the slow way these things are. Not a single bad moment, but months of them, one after another. I sat across from him in the federal building in April, when he gave his final deposition, in the seat they'd set up because he'd asked if I could be there, and I watched him answer questions about the worst years of his life with a steadiness that I recognized after a while as relief, the specific relief of not carrying a hidden thing anymore. The Portside Hub opened the following November, on a cold, bright Thursday that smelled like salt water and fresh paint. We named it Halford's. That had been his idea, and when he told me I cried in front of the construction foreman, which was embarrassing, and Silas pretended not to notice, which was kind. The ground floor had 12 commercial units: a jeweler, a tailor, a woman who made handmade ceramics, a barber who'd been operating out of his house since his old shop got demolished 3 years back, and in the corner space, the one with the best light from the east-facing windows, a shoe repair shop with a new wooden counter that Silas had built himself over 2 weekends in September, sanding every surface by hand. I hung the tools in order above the bench. I put the clock above the door and left it running 4 minutes fast. He came on opening day in jeans and a dark jacket, looking leaner than he had a year ago. The legal process had taken something out of him that hadn't entirely come back yet. The silver more pronounced at his temples, the scar on his wrist showing where his sleeve had pushed back. He moved through the hub the way he'd moved through my grandfather's shop that first morning, really looking, taking his time, not performing interest but actually having it. He stopped at the shoe repair corner last. I was behind the counter. I'd just finished setting up the display, and I was holding a single shoe I'd polished as a sample, turning it in the morning light to check the shine. The light caught it just right. Without thinking, the way I never think about it, the way it just comes, I let out that same low, satisfied whistle. When I looked up, Silas was at the counter watching me with the exact same expression he'd had the very first morning. Something between recognition and amazement. Like he'd followed a long and difficult road back to the place where something true had started. "Still doing that," he said. "Old habit." He put his hands on the counter and leaned forward slightly, and I leaned forward to meet him, and all the noise of the opening day. People talking, music coming from somewhere down the hall, the harbor city going on outside the windows the way it always had, went soft and distant. "Sparrow," he said, still the same word, still carrying everything it had come to mean. "I know," I said. We'd lost a great deal to arrive here. He'd lost more than I could fully calculate. And I had lost the shop and the neighborhood as it was, and the particular quiet shape of the life I'd been building on my own. But Peg had reopened her laundromat 2 doors down the block. Earl came in the first week with his winter work boots, same as always. Mrs. Abramowitz brought her granddaughter to see where her grandmother's dry cleaner used to be, and ended up staying for an hour, buying earrings, talking to the ceramic artist about glazing techniques. Some things you have to let go of in order to hold on to what they actually were. My grandfather understood that, I think, in the way that people understand things when they've been paying close attention to the real version of something long enough that the surface version stops mattering. The smell of the leather, the feel of a seam done right, the particular satisfaction of making something broken into something whole again, and the sound that comes out of you when it works. Silas reached across the counter and covered my hand with his. The scar on his wrist was warm under my thumb. Outside, the harbor was bright and cold, and going on the way it always had, indifferent and constant, the same water it had always been. I thought, this is what my grandfather meant when he said a person should be early. Not to the appointment, to the moment, so you're already there when it arrives, and you don't miss it. I turned my hand over and held on.